Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on incident response and documentation. And you know what? Could there be any less interesting a lesson than talking about documentation of any kind? I just kind of start off by saying that because, well, that is the general consensus. People don't like to talk about documentation. People don't like to do documentation. I'm included in that. I'm terrible with documentation, so I can teach the way it's supposed to be done, and this is probably one of the best examples of something that I don't always practice what I preach. It's not intentional, and it's just not. I just always make the mistake, but I do my best to teach you so you don't make the same mistakes. So I'm going to keep this kind of short and to the point. This is, it's something that's part of the CompTIA objectives, and it's also something that truthfully is a lot more important than people think it is. Honestly, the people who do deal with this stuff, especially if you end up being a security manager or something like that, dealing with incident responses and the documentation, they actually they make quite a bit of money. They are well-respected IT professionals, but it's definitely a certain breed who take on those jobs. So anyway, let's go ahead and jump into it here, and let's start off by talking about some prohibited activities. So here's the thing: we all wish that we lived in a perfect world and everything worked perfectly and everybody worked perfectly. But the reality is that there are always humans going to be involved. And when humans are involved, the bottom line is people make mistakes. Sometimes they're intentional, sometimes they're accidental, but regardless, mistakes do happen. You know what the key is? The key is knowing how to respond when a mistake is made. So what are some of the prohibited activities that you can expect to find? Well, you might have piracy or illegal downloads. That's a big thing right now, especially the illegal download part of it, right? Downloading music, downloading movies, downloading books, all kinds of illegal stuff. How about software, right? And we talk about piracy, whether it be true copying or if it's just, downloading an illegal copy. Adult content. No one admits it, right? No one out there admits that they look at adult content on the internet. No one admits that they ever do it at work. No one admits they ever do it at home. Somehow, nobody views adult content, but yet it's the number one internet business that's out there. Well, it wouldn't be number one if no one was doing it. So it may be something that you don't do. It may be something that you are against. But the fact of the matter is, it is something that is done. Theft. Now, there's two different types of theft. There's physical theft, right? Somebody actually physically steals a computer or something like that. But then there's also things like identity theft. It could be true identity theft, like somebody actually steals someone's identity, their social security number, their credit cards, their everything. And then there also can be an identity theft that is stealing somebody's username and password on a network. There's theft that goes on. So what do you do, right? I mean, again, you want to think that everybody's honest, nobody's going to steal anything, nobody's going to browse inappropriate sites, and nobody's going to steal anything, whether it happens intentionally or accidentally. But what do you do? What do you do when you recognize that something has happened? Well, step one, I actually kind of gave it to you, right? Your first action is to identify. Identify that something has happened. Identify, if possible, identify who is doing it. Identify where it's being done. From there, you then report it. And you want to make sure that you have appropriate reporting documentation. Okay, you want to know what the appropriate channel of communication is when it comes to reporting, right? I mean, if one employee notices another employee is doing something, do they call the CEO of the company and say, I saw, such and such doing this at the desk next to me? No. even if you're working, in IT, do you go straight to the CEO? No. You're going to have, a certain channel of how you escalate things and who you report certain incidences to. Okay, so you want to go ahead and report that something is happening. And the third action, and some people actually believe that maybe, you should focus on this being the first action, or at least, if nothing else, maybe the second action, and that is preservation, meaning protecting yourself. If you notice that somebody is doing something, maybe someone hacked into your network and they're stealing stuff, well, you need to find a way to stop it from happening. Okay, and so again, some people will say that that's the first action. The first thing you do is you see someone has hacked into your network and you need to stop them from stealing your stuff. The first thing you do is unplug from the network, or shut down the servers with all your confidential information, or whatever the case might be. So, that's understandable to think about that maybe being the first thing you do. But the problem is it may not be able to be the first thing because you have to first identify what's going on. Right? Even if you just suspect that somebody's hacked into your network, great. But if you don't know what they're doing, all right, all you know is generically they're in your network, well, you don't know what to do next. Okay, so you need to do a little bit of identifying first. And again, reporting being second versus maybe you preserve everything, lock everything down, and then report it. Again, it's going to depend on the organization. It's going to depend on all the processes you have in place. It's going to depend on the type of business that you're running. And the reason is because you may not want to take an action like preservation without reporting first because you may not have the authority. Okay, so that's one example. You need to report it so that somebody of authority can then flip the switch and start preserving stuff. Or you just may not be certain enough about what you're seeing. You're not experienced enough at exactly what you're seeing. You think that you see something, you shut everything down, and then it turns out that you saw a false positive of some kind of activity. And in the meantime, you shut everything down before you reported it and let the other senior members who you should have reported to analyze the situation first. Now you've shut everything down. Business was shut down, and you actually cost your company money. You maybe cost them to have business stop when you didn't have to. So that's why there is, the order, the way it's set here as far as identify, report, and then preserve. But that order can change depending on your organization and the needs within. Now, something else I want to talk to you about is something called chain of custody, and this is really important. The idea of chain of custody, this is used throughout all of law enforcement. When there is a crime scene, there is a specific chain of custody, even within the law enforcement agencies, as far as who within those agencies are allowed inside of the crime scene, and who can actually look at a piece of evidence, who can touch a piece of evidence, who can move a piece of evidence. And this is all very important when it comes to being able to prosecute. Okay, so you need to make sure that if something is happening, besides identifying it, reporting it, and preserving your data, at the same time, you need to be as careful as possible to preserve whatever evidence there was of the wrongdoing, okay, whatever it was that you found. Okay, so first of all, you need to document. Okay, I mean, it's really important that you document everything. And I'm actually, this is going to come up again in just a few minutes here, but you need to cover your behind. You need to protect yourself. And so by documenting everything and maintaining as much proof of that as possible will help protect you from somebody accusing you of maybe being the one who did the wrongdoing, or protect you from falsely accusing somebody else. You want to make sure to keep a record of who has had their hands on the evidence. Okay? Chain of custody is so important as far as who was ever in custody of the evidence. Okay, and the reason why is because, again, what if the evidence suddenly got altered or points in a different direction, and now they're going to come at you Well, you need to know who all had access to that evidence who could have potentially altered it. By having a chain of custody of evidence in place, in other words, you know in advance, this is the chain of custody, this is where things go, it will help assure that evidence is not tampered with. So as much as a moment ago I was just talking about have a record of whoever had it, so that if it was tampered with, you know who to go to. But it helps to assure that there's no tampering. And as I mentioned originally, it is critical for the legal processes. Okay, somebody does something illegal in your environment, just as we see all the time, right? We see and hear about it all the time on the news. And even more often than that, it's done on TV shows and movies all the time. As far as you have some bad person out there and they've done something and the whole world knows they did it, but we can't prosecute because the evidence was not handled properly. There wasn't, everything didn't go through the chain of custody. So it's so important, if you are ever going to consider prosecuting a wrongdoer in your environment, you have to maintain an appropriate chain of custody. Now, again, the bottom line is, you want to document the heck out of everything. And you do this to protect yourself. And I will tell you that documentation as a whole, we could probably do a whole lesson just on documentation. And you'll notice here that I told you that's like the most boring stuff there is a lesson on documentation. So I've kind of avoided it, and I kept this more about incidents, responses, and stuff like that. But when it comes to documentation as a whole, whether we're talking about incident responses or even if we're just in general talking about maintaining good documentation on inventory of things, procedures on how to do things. How about documentation on, to keep it related to what we're talking about here on incident response, documentation on what the proper incident response processes are. And then even beyond that, you have to have documentation on how to make changes to the documentation, right? Because processes change. Okay, so you want to make sure that you keep as thorough documentation as possible. And if you ever see something that's not thoroughly documented, if there's not some process that you think might come into your world and you don't know what you would do, well, you may want to press the issue and say, we need some documentation on this. It'll protect yourself because you can be held liable. Your company might be held liable. Okay, so again, it may not be you, the individual, but you could be, as a representative of your company, if you perform an action just on your own because you think it's the right thing to do, you can actually have the company be held liable. And overall, documentation helps you to be safe and be smart. And it helps you be smart because you don't actually have to be smart then, as long as you know how to read. You can just read on what you're supposed to do. So that's kind of the gist of it. And as promised, I said this would be kind of short and to the point. So the bottom line is, just to kind of wrap this up, things happen. There is no perfect world. A really good IT professional is one who knows how to respond when things happen. The great IT professionals are not the ones who pride themselves on having a network set up or a computer set up that nothing ever goes wrong, because eventually they will. Okay, you can think you pride yourself on that, but the bottom line is you're only great until something goes wrong. And then if you don't know how to respond, your company quickly realizes that you're worthless. Okay, so it's really important that you know how to act when something goes wrong. And I talked here about prohibited activities, but there's also the idea of what to do even if it's not a prohibited activity. Data gets lost. How do we go to our backups and get it? Okay, I mean that's another example of an incident and then having to respond to it. And it had nothing to do with anybody doing anything wrong, right? Computer crash, hard drive crash, data's gone. What do we do? How do we get it back? Knowing how to deal with these things is so crucial. But other than that, I will not beat that dead horse any further. I will simply thank you for watching this brief lesson, and I will see you in the next one.